I'm Alison Morse. I'm Vice President of Philanthropic Consulting here at National Philanthropic Trust. I lead a team that works with donors on defining their giving goals and identifying ways to give, all with the goal of advancing National Philanthropic Trust's mission of increasing philanthropy in society. And I'm so thrilled to be joined today by two philanthropy experts. And I'll first welcome Miki Akimoto from National Center for Family Philanthropy. Miki is Chief Impact Officer there and oversees strategy, partnerships, and evaluation of their programming. And if you aren't familiar with NCFP, we're so thrilled to have them as a partner. They have fantastic resources focused on multi-generational family giving. I'll also introduce my colleague, Jenna Mulhall-Brereton, who is Chief Philanthropic Solutions Officer here at National Philanthropic Trust, where she leads several teams that are focused on stewardship of our donors and their grant making. So welcome to you both. And Miki, welcome to you, who's joining us from the West Coast today. So I'm so thrilled to have them both here because they'll both offer their experience and insights from working with individuals and families on defining goals, values, but most importantly, thinking about this topic of legacy and leaving a philanthropic legacy. So just to set the stage a little bit for today, what we're hoping to accomplish is to set kind of a big picture for you of what philanthropic legacy means, and then dive into a little bit more detail of what legacy planning looks like specifically for a donor advised fund. And then lastly, we always like to talk about both the positive and the inspiration, but maybe some pitfalls or cautionary tales that you can take with you. And I'm just going to say on a final note, in terms of terminology, we'll be talking about NCFP, National Center for Family Philanthropy, and we're also going to be talking about DAFs. So if you aren't familiar with that term, that is a donor advised fund. So welcome to our guests. And Miki, I would love to start with you in terms of all the work that you and your team at NCFP have done with families around this topic of legacy and succession. Can you ground us to start in a definition of what is legacy philanthropy?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having us with you today, and thank you for being such great partners. We always love working with you. I think one of the things about legacy is it's one of those words that probably carries a lot of implications for people that we need to reframe in these times. And so often, I think in the past, legacy has been something that happens to a family or happens to a donor after they've moved on or they've passed. And it's sort of that retrospective assessment of what does their life and their giving mean. And more, we are really recognizing that we are ourselves living legacies. We are the legacy of those who have come before us, and we are creating the legacy for those who will come after us. And so that we're part of this wonderful arc and continuum. And so if you think about the legacy, it's something that is actively being considered and crafted to really tell the story and carry forward the values and intent and impact of what is the change that you're trying to make in the world. And so within NCFP, we have what we talk about as the modern legacy framework. And there are really 5 areas, or what we call levers, that you could think about pulling as you're crafting this legacy. The first is values. What are the values that you as a giver are thinking about, and how do those values then align or differ with those with whom you're giving? What is your intent? Like, what is motivating you to give? What was your founder's intent if you are in fact the legacy of a philanthropic story? And what is the intent and story and intention that you want to carry forward? So many of us are really rooted first and foremost in place. And so what are the places that you feel connected to? What is the legacy that you want to leave in a place? And have the places that you're connected to or that you want to have an impact in changed over time? And how does that figure into your legacy story? family is critical. Obviously, we're the National Center for Family Philanthropy, but overall, within thinking about a legacy, the story of your family, where it came from, where it is now, and what it will mean in the future is a huge part of what you're thinking about. And so questions to think about are, as you're giving together as a family, how does that impact where and what you give? But equally, how does what you're doing as givers impact your family? It's a two-way story of legacy within your family. And then finally, action. What are the actions that you're taking to craft this legacy? So that I would say is some of the ways of thinking about legacy. And then it's important that you take an active role in defining it.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to stay with you for a moment because you started to touch on this a little bit, that we are all kind of living legacies. But one question that we hear a lot is, when should I start my legacy planning? So if I could ask you of a timeline, maybe.
I would say there's no wrong time to start, except if you're only doing it at the end. And from a point of view, I think there's 2 points I would make. One is it's never really too early to start, because so often as you start thinking about defining your philanthropic purpose, that North Star that you're going to have in your giving, you're implicitly thinking about your legacy in that, but being concrete and explicit or beginning to pull out those threads. And it's not a set and forget, that this is a conversation you need to keep coming back to and revisiting. You, your family, the communities that you're in, the issues that you care about, they're all going to evolve. And so how do you think about your legacy in relationship to that evolution?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for giving us that framework. Jenna, if I can turn to you to pivot us a little bit into the more defined world of donor advised funds and how a legacy plan might work within that vehicle.
Sure. Thanks, Alison. And Miki, I'm so glad we started with you, because I think it was important to paint that big picture and to really talk about what we're trying to achieve here, all the things that you have to consider as you think about your legacy and what you want to leave behind. And so just everything you said really resonated with me. And now I'm going to pivot to the more kind of mundane aspect of it, I suppose. But I think following having these reflections and these conversations with family that Miki talked about, you do want to get it on paper. And so obviously for, just like you would have last will and testament that you would want to have in place, the same thing, you want to think about the legacy of, for example, your donor advised fund, which Alison, you asked me to specifically talk about. And so there's a way to get that on paper as well. And National Philanthropic Trust, we have what's called a legacy plan. If you have a donor advised fund somewhere else, they will also have a mechanism for this. It may not be called exactly the same thing, but it will certainly be a very similar type mechanism. And essentially, you just want to capture on paper or on your donor portal, as it were, what your plans are for those assets in your donor advised fund when you pass. And there's different ways to think about that, and we'll get into that in a little while. But just want to say that from my perspective, I believe that I would like to see, when everyone opens the donor advised fund, that they are doing their legacy plan same day. And to Miki's point about how this evolves, it's absolutely true. This can continue to evolve. So it's not like, the answer you put down on day one is going to be the same plan that you have a year from now or 20 years from now. But you should have some plan, and we can talk through the nitty gritty of that a little later, but that's the broad brushstrokes.
Great. Thank you. Miki, I want to come back to you because you started to frame in one of your pillars the importance of family. And we know that family looks really different to everybody these days. And so as people start to think about what their values are and the intent of their giving, can you talk about who might be involved and what the variety of characters could be who join somebody's philanthropic journey?
Absolutely. And I just really want to echo Jenna's point about the importance of getting this on paper and the importance of clarity. And I think that's a theme that we'll probably be picking up in the next parts of these conversations. And so in terms of identifying who's involved, it's all very individual. There's the old joke that you've seen one family philanthropy, you've seen one family philanthropy, or that there's as many kinds of philanthropy as there are families. That being said, I would say that if taking the lens, for instance, of the wealth creator, the person who started the giving, perhaps, you could start thinking about this in terms of concentric circles. Like, who are the values that you really want to reflect? It typically will start with you and perhaps a partner or a core family group. Then as you think about the legacy that you're trying to create, and you think about the areas in which you want to have an impact, and that could be a place, it could be an issue like education, it could be a population like young women interested in science. In each of those areas, you think about that legacy, that ripple that you want to have in the waters. Who are the voices that you need at the table to help you make informed decisions? And if you go back to some of those pillars that I was talking about, there's a values piece, which is often about which are the family members that you involve, what are the values that you're trying to bring across generations. But as you also think about having an impact in place, are you talking to people who are in those places that can help inform you make the best decisions about what changes are needed? So I would say there's no one particular checklist, but I think a question to ask yourself throughout is, if I want to have this legacy, if I want to see this piece of change in the world, who are the voices that I need? What are the values that I need to include? Who are the experts that I need to think about to listen to in some way, which could include decision making, it could be advisory. There's different ways of bringing those voices into the planning. But making sure that you're hearing from the most diverse cast of characters that you can, to sort of pick up your analogy, Alison, of really having the information you need to think critically about that legacy. And actually, let me make one other quick point,
Yeah,
which
sure.
is in the legacy planning document that I'm sure that you have at NPT, you're naming the people who will steward your legacy after you're gone, who's going to pick up and carry forward your intent. And so getting those folks involved early and informed is also really critical.
Miki, you're doing my job for me, because I was going to ask Jenna about, in terms of a donor advised fund legacy plan, what those options are.
Yeah, that's a great segue, Miki. So yes, that is indeed one option for a donor advised fund here at NPT. And again, I would posit probably at most donor advised funds will have several options. And one of which is certainly exactly that, to designate some others that can carry on your philanthropic legacy after you pass as successor donor advisors. So that could be, for example, adult children. That could be your nieces and nephews. That could be some other loved one. That could be a dear friend. That could be an advisor, someone that you have, a business relationship with, somebody who's managed your finances. So there's all different ways that could look. But Miki made a great point that ideally you're having those conversations ahead of time. And we can come back to that, but I'm sure we've all seen circumstances where that hasn't necessarily been communicated ahead of time, and that's a surprise, when somebody finds out that they're a successor advisor. So at NPT, that's one option. You can designate a successor advisor, and then they will have a donor advised fund for which they are an advisor that will be funded from your DAF as that collapses and those funds go into theirs. You could do that with multiple people. It doesn't have to be one person. So say you had, 4 children that you wanted to do this with, you could set up 4 different DAFs. As one option. Another option is to designate charitable beneficiaries to get a lump sum when you pass. And that could be one, that could be multiple, and that could be percentages of the DAF assets at the time. So I will say, when I set up my DAF, again, because I think you have to have that plan in place from day one, and I'm sure it will evolve. But when I set it up, I said, I have a donor advised fund with my husband as the joint advisor. And so I said, if we both pass, I want 50% to go to this nonprofit that I really care about, and 50% to go to this one that he really cares about. That's probably one of the more simple ways that you could handle it, but that's what I've done for now. And I will say, I also see very often from nonprofits some really great communication around this. So organizations that I donate to will often, when they're sending out appeals or reports, will sometimes have a note, or sometimes it's even like on the back of the envelope. So it's really noticeable. Don't forget that you can designate us as a charitable recipient of your donor advised fund. So that is one way that a lot of nonprofits think about bequest gifts, and it's definitely something to consider. And then the third option, and I guess I should say also that you don't have to pick just one of these options. There could be a combo therein. But the third option at NPT is to establish an endowment to recommend that assets be transferred to specific grantee organizations over time at a set cadence. So that's another option as well.
Great that there are a lot of options, and also, great that there are ways to, invite many people into this process. Jenna, you've raised some really great points around designating charitable beneficiaries. I'm wondering if you can provide a couple of examples of maybe when that decision comes up for donors. If maybe they don't have children, or just examples of when that might come up.
Of when they should be thinking about this, or
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that again, I think you can probably tell I'm an advocate for there's no such thing as thinking about this too early, and it evolving over time. But I think as you start to think about, as you go through your philanthropic journey and you are giving to certain organizations that you find you're giving to over and over, that you are either developing a relationship with, or you're finding that their mission and their programming just really resonates for you, I would say that's the time to think about, is this an organization that I would like to be thinking about as part of my legacy? And you don't have to do it like I said, 50% here and 50% there. You could say 10%, to these 10 different organizations that work in these sectors that I care about. Sometimes people, I think, really have a strong sense of the issues that are very important to them and that they want to impact, but or that they want to be able to give to, but that they don't really always have the strongest sense of which organizations are working in these issue areas that they should know about. And so that is something that we can help donors with. And sometimes that's, a brief conversation to help give some guidance in terms of how to think about exploring. And sometimes we can help donors with some research to help them kind of feel a little bit more equipped to understand a sector. And we do put sector guides up on our website for the public, and also on our donor portal pretty regularly. So those are some ways to kind of start doing that research. But I would just come back to, I would caution, don't wait to feel like you have it perfectly mapped out and you understand every single nuance of exactly what you want to do before you get things on paper. I think put something down that you can live with as a placeholder until you get to a place where you feel like you have the exact plan that you want.
Okay, so everybody's takeaway from today is do it now. Don't put it on the back burner. Miki, coming back to you, as we promised at the top, we would talk about some risks or cautionary tales of what happens when a legacy plan isn't in place for giving. And just as a heads up, Jenna, I'll ask you the same in terms of, specific to the DAFs.
So I can give a couple of examples. One that really springs to mind for me is, I think, a cautionary tale around the making plans without looping in the folks that you expect to carry this work forward. And so I can think of a family that I worked with at another organization where tragically, two parents were killed in a car crash. So a single death event, which then put in motion the creation of a charitable foundation where something like 80 to 90% of a significant amount of assets went into this foundation. And 3 adult children were named as the trustees for this foundation. The children had no idea this was coming, and they had expected to inherit this money outright as opposed to inheriting a charitable legacy. So there was just fury among the offspring about this. And they were a group that had never really worked together to make joint decisions or be aligned around values or a philanthropic vision. And what happened is they wound up blowing the foundation apart into sub foundations and sort of all going off and doing their own thing. So the parents never had a conversation with them about what is the intent that we have, never had the conversation, which was clearly implied that we hope that you will work together. They didn't do the work of creating that joint vision. And so to me, this feels like a moment where there was a clear intent around legacy that was not well communicated and was not revisited at a key moment in time. I've also seen examples of people who just don't make decisions, and then assets are sort of distributed based on state law or other things where there might have been an intent to be charitable that was never carried out. And so I think that there's these cautionary tales, whereas on the flip side, you see the families that are actively bringing in the next generation, actively having these conversations and shaping their legacy with multiple voices, and you just see both the impact of the giving in the current situation, as well as you see the excitement among the next generation or successor stewards about, we really want to take this forward and do this good work.
Thank you for that, Jenna. To you.
So specifically about donor advised funds, you'd like me to speak to. So yeah, I would say, so at NPT, if a donor passes and we have no legacy plan, obviously the goal of donor advised funds is grant making. So we need to get those funds out in grants. And so the first thing we would do is look to see what the history of grant making has been. And sometimes that's helpful, and sometimes it's less so. I mean, if you think somebody could have recently opened up a DAF, but also sometimes I think there can be a critical mass of grant making that might be perhaps because a friend asked you to give to a fundraiser and you wanted to support it one time, or perhaps you were giving for memorial gifts and those were meaningful one-time gifts, but not necessarily a place that you would have chosen for your own legacy. So I would say it's a starting point, but you don't necessarily want someone else to be looking at kind of the map of your giving and trying to figure out what your intentions were based on that, when you could have just spelled out what your intentions were. And so that's option one. And then sometimes that, again, if there isn't that history because it's a new donor advised fund, then NPT will then put those assets into a fund that then we grant. And so again, that's not, what NPT wants to do. We want to be able to have donors recommend where they want the grants to go. And so hence, the strong push for legacy planning. And I think coming back more broadly, speaking to something Miki was talking about, made me think about going back to the idea of the three options with regard to successor advisors, or giving the other two options to give outright to charitable beneficiaries or an endowment. I think it's really important to think about what you're trying to achieve. And if your goal is to make sure that your successor advisors have some autonomy to make decisions that are meaningful to them and pursue philanthropic pursuits that perhaps are continuing broadly in the vein you were going, but give them some autonomy, then by all means, I think that's a great option. If the goal is for them to just give to the specific organizations that you wanted to give to, then I think then instead a better option is to give directly, to just say, I want to give to charitable beneficiaries instead.
So we're kind of coming toward the end of our time. Miki, I want to ask you one last question that goes back into the realm of family, and particularly families that are maybe quite large, quite embedded in a community. And so how do you think about the individual, the family as a collective, and then the community that they may want to engage?
I think that there's multiple ways of going about it. And one of the more interesting examples that I can think of is the family that is located very deeply rooted in a town in the Midwest and deeply engaged in the community. And they did a year of learning where they went out and did focus groups with nonprofits. They went to community meetings to really just reground themselves in where the community is now, what the issues are that they're facing, and then thinking about realigning that with the giving and the legacy that they want to have in the community. So I think that one of the frames I would think about is a posture of learning and reflection, of taking in and stepping back and saying, maybe, this is what we've been doing or what we've been thinking as our family, but, where are we now? What are we hearing from new generations, and being open to new points of view, and then reassessing from there.
Great. So our time has zipped by together, and we've covered a large amount of territory in a short time, but I want to leave people, we know the action item of starting now, but what else could you leave us with in terms of either an example of a creative way somebody is approaching their legacy, or other, uplifting? We'll finish on an uplifting note.
I'm happy to jump in. Miki, you go ahead. You look like you're going to start. You go ahead.
I was going to say, make it fun. That legacy doesn't have to be serious, and can and should be fun. And there's no dearth of opportunities that we all have. We now all have video recorders in our hands. We have tape recorders in our hands. And so I've seen so many great legacy projects start with like grandkids interviewing grandparents about like, how did you start this? Like, why did you start this? What did you want people to know? Creating an archive of family stories. We've seen people do like the Shutterstock books where you can put together pictures that tell the story. So there's all these ways that you can make this legacy concrete and fun, as well as something that you're really taking forward into the future.
I love that, Miki. That's a great story. And I would say, I would just add to that, we talked about getting it on paper and having those conversations early about the people that you're hoping will carry on your legacy. And I would just say that I think doing that early is an act of love, because it can be really comforting to your family or your loved ones or whoever is going to be stepping in to fulfill your wishes after your passing. It can be really comforting to know that they're positioned to be able to fulfill your wishes. So I would think of it that way.
Great. Thank you both. I also want to thank our attendees, some of whom sent us questions in advance that helped us shape this conversation. So thank you for your engagement. And I'll note that if this conversation piqued some interest in you, our partners at NCFP will be hosting a webinar on April 25th. That is like the next stage in this conversation, which is meaningfully engaging the next generation of philanthropists. And so we will be there. We hope you will be there too. And of course, you can find more information on NPT's website at npt.org. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.